Hey guys, tonight we begin with the absolute nightmare of being born French in the wrong century. We're diving deep into what it was really like to wake up every morning as a peasant in 1790s France during those final brutal years before everything exploded into revolution. Forget the romantic countryside scenes you see in movies. The truth is, you probably wouldn't have survived a single week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You open your eyes at dawn in 1794, somewhere in the French countryside. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? Everything else. Your stomach is already cramping with hunger before you're fully awake, because yesterday's meal was a watery soup made from turnips and whatever weeds you could scavenge from the roadside. Your bed is a pile of moldy straw in the corner of a one-room hovel that you share with your spouse, 3 children, a goat, and whatever rats have decided to call your floor home. The smell is a symphony of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and despair that's been fermenting for months. But here's what makes 1790s France particularly special in the grand catalog of human misery. This wasn't just poverty. This wasn't just hardship. This was a society so broken, so fundamentally rigged against the common person, that revolution wasn't just inevitable, it was the only rational response to the daily torture of existence. You were living through what historians now call the final crisis of the Ancien Regime, and every single day was a masterclass in why entire civilizations sometimes just collapse under their own weight. Welcome to pre-revolutionary France, where being poor wasn't just about having less money. It was about being systematically crushed by a machine designed to extract every possible ounce of labor, dignity, and hope from your body until you died, hopefully before you became too expensive to maintain. And the truly beautiful part? The people running this machine genuinely believed they were doing God's work. Let's start with the obvious question. What did you eat? Well, that depends on how you define eating. If by eating you mean putting something, anything, into your mouth to stop the gnawing pain in your stomach, then congratulations, you ate almost every day. If by eating you mean consuming enough calories to function as a human being, well, that was more of a seasonal privilege. Your staple food was bread, not good bread, not the crusty golden loaves you're imagining. We're talking about pain bis, a dense, gritty mixture of rye, barley, and whatever grain-adjacent substances your local baker could legally get away with including. Sawdust was common, ground acorns when times got really desperate. Sometimes you'd find mysterious dark specks that might have been insects or might have been small rocks. Nobody asked too many questions. This bread made up about 70% of your daily calories, assuming you could afford it. And here's the kicker. Bread prices fluctuated wildly based on harvests, weather, and the whims of grain speculators who treated human starvation as a market opportunity. When grain harvests failed, which happened regularly, bread prices could triple overnight. Imagine if your rent suddenly cost 3 times as much without warning, except instead of losing your apartment, you just slowly starved to death. But bread was the luxury item. When bread became unaffordable, you downgraded to soup. Cabbage soup, turnip soup, soup made from whatever vegetable scraps you could beg, borrow, or steal from someone else's garden. And when even vegetables became too expensive, you made soup from grass, literally. Boiled grass with salt if you were lucky enough to have salt. Meat was basically a fairy tale. Maybe, if you were extraordinarily fortunate, you might taste a small piece of salt pork or bacon fat once or twice a month. Chicken was for special occasions, like weddings or funerals. Fresh meat was for the nobility, and even seeing it could remind you just how vast the gap was between your world and theirs. Dairy products existed in theory. You might have access to some thin, sour milk if you owned a goat or if your neighbor was feeling generous. Cheese was expensive and usually rancid by the time it reached rural areas. Butter was a luxury item that cost more per pound than most peasants earned in a week. And vegetables? Only what you could grow yourself in whatever tiny plot of land you might have access to. Potatoes were still viewed with suspicion by many French peasants, even though they would eventually become a survival staple. Most people survived on turnips, onions, and cabbage when they could get them. Fresh fruit was almost unheard of, unless you happened to live near someone's orchard and were willing to risk a beating for theft. The truly heartbreaking part was watching families make impossible decisions about food distribution. Parents would go without eating so their children could have an extra spoonful of soup. Children would pretend to be full so their younger siblings could eat. And everyone went to bed hungry most nights because there simply wasn't enough food to go around. But let's talk about where you lived, because your housing situation made your food situation look luxurious by comparison. Your typical peasant dwelling was essentially a wooden box with pretensions. One room, maybe two if you were particularly prosperous, with walls made of whatever materials were cheapest and most readily available, usually a combination of wood, mud, and stones, held together with prayer and stubbornness. The roof was thatched, which sounds quaint until you realize that thatched roofs leaked constantly, harbored every insect imaginable, and occasionally caught fire for no apparent reason. When it rained, and it rained frequently in 1790s France, water dripped steadily through the roof onto whatever happened to be below: your furniture, your food, your children, your bed. Everything was perpetually damp and slowly rotting. Windows were a luxury that most peasant homes simply didn't have. Maybe one small opening covered with oiled paper or cloth to let in a tiny amount of light while keeping out the worst of the weather. Glass windows were for wealthy people. You made do with darkness and whatever illumination you could get from your fireplace or a precious candle. Speaking of the fireplace, it served as your heating system, your cooking facility, your light source, and your entertainment center all rolled into one. It was basically the most important feature of your home, and it barely worked. The chimney, if you had one, was poorly constructed and filled your single room with smoke regularly. Many peasant homes didn't have proper chimneys at all, just holes in the roof that let smoke escape while also letting weather in. Furniture was minimal and handmade: a rough wooden table, maybe a couple of stools, a chest for storing your few possessions. Your bed was often just a pile of straw in the corner, covered with whatever cloth you could spare, Privacy was a concept that didn't exist. Everyone slept in the same room, often in the same bed, regardless of age or relationship. Personal space was measured in inches, and remember, you weren't living alone in this architectural disaster. Your spouse, your children, and often your elderly parents all shared this space, plus whatever animals you owned, goats, chickens, maybe a pig if you were prosperous. They lived inside with you because leaving them outside meant they would be stolen, and also because their body heat helped keep everyone slightly less frozen during winter months. The smell was indescribable. Unwashed human bodies, animal waste, rotting food, mold, smoke, and the general aroma of despair all combined into an olfactory assault that would probably knock a modern person unconscious. But you got used to it because you had no choice. Everyone smelled terrible, so no one really noticed anymore. Sanitation was a word that hadn't been invented yet, at least not in any practical sense. You relieved yourself in a pit behind your house, assuming you had space for a pit. If not, you used whatever corner seemed most convenient and hoped for the best. Waste disposal meant throwing things out the door and letting nature take its course. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, which brings us to our next cheerful topic. Healthcare in 1790s rural France was essentially a combination of folk remedies, prayer, and hoping you were tough enough to survive whatever was trying to kill you. Doctors existed, but they were expensive luxuries for wealthy urban dwellers. In the countryside, you made do with whatever local wisdom had been passed down through generations, most of which was completely useless, and some of which was actively harmful. Got a fever? Try bloodletting, which involved cutting open your veins to release the bad humors that were obviously causing your illness. This treatment was guaranteed to make you weaker and more likely to die, but it was considered the height of medical sophistication. Broken bone? Set it yourself with whatever materials you had available and hope it healed straight. Infected wound? Pack it with mud or animal dung, both of which were readily available and absolutely guaranteed to make the infection worse. Childbirth was basically a death lottery for women. No anesthesia, no antiseptics, no understanding of basic hygiene. Women gave birth in the same conditions where they lived, surrounded by animals and waste, attended by neighbors who meant well but had no medical training. Infant mortality was so high that parents often didn't bother naming children until they were several months old and had demonstrated some likelihood of survival. Common diseases that we consider minor annoyances today were often death sentences. A simple respiratory infection could kill you. Diarrhea could kill you. A minor cut that got infected could kill you. And epidemic diseases like smallpox, typhus, or dysentery would sweep through communities regularly, killing substantial portions of the population. But here's what made the 1790s particularly brutal. This wasn't just the normal grinding poverty that had characterized peasant life for centuries. This was poverty with a special French twist, a tax system so comprehensively evil that it seemed designed by someone who actively hated poor people. Let's talk about taxes, because the French tax system in the 1790s was a masterpiece of systematic oppression. As a peasant, you paid taxes to everyone. You paid taxes to the king, taxes to the local lord, taxes to the church, and taxes on top of taxes just because the government could think of new things to tax. The taille was the main royal tax. and it was assessed based on your supposed ability to pay, which meant the tax collectors basically made up numbers based on how much they thought they could extract from you without killing you immediately. The gabelle was the salt tax, which was particularly cruel because salt was necessary for preserving food, but the government maintained a monopoly on salt sales and charged outrageous prices for it. Then there were seigneurial dues, payments you owed to your local lord for the privilege of existing on land that his ancestors had stolen from someone else centuries earlier. You paid fees to use the lord's mill to grind your grain, fees to use his oven to bake your bread, fees to cross bridges, fees to sell goods at market. Every aspect of economic life had a fee attached to it. The church took its tithe, officially 10% of your agricultural production, though in practice they often demanded more, and this was just the beginning. There were taxes on your windows, taxes on your livestock, taxes on your tools, taxes on your marriage, taxes on your death. The French government had managed to create a tax system that made poverty not just painful, but literally expensive. And here's the beautiful part that really drove people to revolution. While you were paying all these taxes and fees and tithes, the people who actually had money, the nobility and the clergy, were exempt from most taxation. The tax burden fell almost entirely on the people least able to bear it, while the wealthy lived in luxury funded by peasant misery. But we're just getting started with this catalog of systematic oppression, because even if you somehow managed to scrape together enough money to pay all your taxes and feed your family, you still had to deal with the corvée, which was forced unpaid labor for the state. Several times a year, you were required to drop whatever you were doing and work on road maintenance, bridge construction, or other public works projects. No compensation, no choice in the matter. Just show up with your tools and work for however many days the local officials decided was necessary. If you didn't show up, you faced fines that you couldn't afford or imprisonment that would leave your family without any income at all. This forced labor system meant that during crucial agricultural periods, when you needed to be planting or harvesting your crops, you might be pulled away to build roads that you would never benefit from, in service of a government that seemed to exist primarily to make your life more miserable. And speaking of making your life more miserable, let's discuss the legal system, because justice in 1790s France was about as fair and balanced as you'd expect from a society where your social class determined your legal rights. As a peasant, you had essentially no legal protections. If a nobleman decided to ride his horse through your grain field, destroying months of work, you had no recourse. If a tax collector decided you owed more money than you actually did, you had no effective way to appeal. If your lord decided to increase your feudal obligations, you could complain, but your complaint would be heard by judges who were appointed by and owed their positions to the same noble class that was oppressing you. The legal system operated on the principle that some people were simply worth more than others. A nobleman's word was worth more than a peasant's word. A clergyman's testimony carried more weight than a farmer's. Evidence and facts mattered less than social status and political connections. Criminal justice was arbitrary and brutal. Punishments were designed not just to deter crime, but to reinforce social hierarchies. A peasant caught stealing food might be executed, while a nobleman who killed a peasant in a fit of rage might face no consequences at all. Civil courts were equally rigged. Property disputes were decided by judges who owned property themselves and had every incentive to protect property rights over human rights. Contract disputes were resolved in favor of whoever had more money to spend on legal representation, and debt collection was a particularly vicious process where creditors could have you imprisoned indefinitely until your family somehow scraped together the money you owed, which was impossible if you were the family's primary income earner. But let's step back from the legal system and talk about something even more fundamental, your daily work routine, because even if you manage to navigate the taxes and the forced labor and the legal system, you still had to figure out how to actually survive from day to day. Most French peasants were agricultural workers, either farming their own tiny plots of land or working as laborers on someone else's property. And when I say tiny plots, I mean tiny. The average peasant farm was maybe 5 or 6 acres, barely enough to feed a single family even in good years. Most of this land was of poor quality, the kind of marginal soil that wealthier landowners didn't want. Your agricultural tools were primitive and expensive. A plow was a major investment that might take years to pay off. Most peasants made do with hand tools, hoes, and sickles, and wooden spades that broke frequently and needed constant repair. Horses were for rich people. If you were lucky, you might own an ox to help with heavy work, but more likely you were pulling your own plow by hand. The agricultural cycle dominated everything. Spring meant planting, assuming you had managed to save enough seed grain from the previous harvest and hadn't been forced to eat it during the winter months. Summer meant endless weeding and pest control and praying that the weather would cooperate. Autumn meant harvest, which was a race against time to get your crops gathered before they rotted in the fields or were stolen by hungry neighbors. And winter meant unemployment and slow starvation. There was no agricultural work during the winter months, which meant no income for several months out of every year. You survived winter by eating whatever food you had managed to preserve from the harvest, assuming there was anything left after you paid your taxes and feudal obligations. But agricultural work was just one part of the survival puzzle. Most peasant families also engaged in various forms of cottage industry to supplement their income. Women spun thread and wove cloth. Men carved wooden tools or made simple pottery. Children gathered firewood or helped with food preservation. These cottage industries were regulated by urban guilds that controlled production and pricing. You couldn't just make things and sell them wherever you wanted. You had to follow guild rules about quality and quantity and marketing, and you had to pay fees to the guilds for the privilege of working in their regulated industries. Even something as simple as selling eggs at the local market required navigating a complex web of regulations and fees. Market stalls cost money to rent. You needed permits to sell certain types of goods. Tax collectors monitored transactions and demanded their percentage of every sale, and the markets themselves were controlled by urban merchants who could manipulate prices to their advantage. They would buy agricultural products cheap from desperate peasants and then sell them at much higher prices to urban consumers, keeping most of the profit for themselves, while the people who actually produced the goods remained poor. Transportation was another constant challenge. Roads were terrible, basically just dirt paths that turned into impassable mud whenever it rained. Getting goods to market meant either carrying them yourself, which limited how much you could transport, or paying for cart transport, which ate up most of your potential profit. Communication was equally difficult. News traveled slowly and unreliably. You might not hear about important political developments for weeks or months after they happened. This isolation made it easy for local officials to lie to you about laws and regulations, knowing that you had no way to verify their claims. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of peasant life in 1790s France was the complete absence of hope for improvement. This wasn't temporary hardship that you could work your way out of. This was a permanent condition that would define your entire life and your children's lives and their children's lives. Social mobility was essentially non-existent. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant. Your children would be peasants. Your grandchildren would be peasants. The social hierarchy was considered natural and ordained by God, and challenging it was not just illegal, but literally unthinkable for most people. Education was reserved for the wealthy. Most peasants were completely illiterate, which meant they couldn't read contracts or legal documents or even religious texts. They had to rely on others to interpret written information for them, which created endless opportunities for fraud and manipulation. The church preached that suffering was virtuous, that poverty was a blessing, and that your reward would come in the afterlife if you just endured your earthly misery with sufficient patience and humility. This religious ideology served to justify the social order and discourage people from questioning why their lives were so difficult. But even religion offered little real comfort. Church services were conducted in Latin, which most peasants didn't understand. Religious festivals provided occasional breaks from work, but they also required financial contributions that poor families could barely afford. The local priest was often just another tax collector, demanding payment for baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Your marriage prospects were determined by economic necessity rather than personal choice. Families arranged marriages based on what made the most financial sense, combining small plots of land or sharing the burden of caring for elderly parents. Love was a luxury that most people couldn't afford to consider. Having children was both necessary and terrifying. You needed children to help with work and to care for you in old age. But every additional mouth to feed made survival more difficult. And the constant possibility of child death meant that emotional attachment was always mixed with the expectation of loss. Women faced additional hardships beyond the general misery of peasant life. They had no legal rights independent of their husbands or fathers. They could not own property, enter into contracts, or make legal decisions about their own lives. Domestic violence was considered normal and acceptable. Women were expected to be perpetually pregnant and to work just as hard as men while also managing all household responsibilities. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly dangerous under these conditions. Poor nutrition made pregnancy complications more likely. Lack of medical care meant that problems during delivery often resulted in death for both mother and child. Many women died young from the cumulative effects of multiple pregnancies under conditions of extreme poverty. But let's talk about what happened when you got sick, because illness was not just a health crisis, but an economic disaster that could destroy your family's survival prospects. Remember, there was no sick leave, no disability insurance, no social safety net of any kind. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. Common illnesses that we barely think about today were often fatal under these conditions. A respiratory infection could turn into pneumonia, which could kill you within days. Digestive problems could lead to dehydration and death. Even minor injuries could become infected and result in blood poisoning. But even if an illness didn't kill you, it could destroy your economic prospects. A farmer who broke his leg during planting season might lose his entire crop. A spinner who developed arthritis in her hands might lose her primary source of income. A laborer who suffered a back injury might become permanently unemployable. And if you survived an illness, you often emerged weakened and less capable of heavy physical labor, which meant lower wages and greater difficulty supporting your family. Chronic health problems were essentially death sentences, just slower ones. The psychological toll of this constant precariousness was enormous. You lived every day knowing that a single misfortune could destroy everything you had worked for. A bad harvest, an injury, an illness, a change in tax policies, any of these could push you from mere poverty into actual starvation. This uncertainty created a culture of hoarding and mistrust. Families hid whatever small amounts of food or money they managed to accumulate, because sharing with neighbors today might mean your own children went hungry tomorrow. Community cooperation existed, but it was always balanced against the brutal calculus of survival. And through it all, you watched the nobility live in luxury that was so extravagant it seemed to mock your suffering. While you were eating grass soup, aristocrats were hosting elaborate feasts where they threw away more food than you saw in a month. While you were wearing the same ragged clothes for years, nobles changed outfits multiple times per day just because they could. This contrast wasn't accidental or hidden. It was deliberately displayed as a demonstration of social hierarchy. Aristocrats wanted peasants to see their wealth and power, because that display reinforced the message that some people were simply born to rule, while others were born to serve. The truly maddening part was that this aristocratic luxury was funded directly by peasant labor and peasant taxes. Every silk dress, every elaborate meal, every ornate piece of furniture in a noble's mansion represented resources that had been extracted from people who were literally starving to death. And the nobles justified this system by claiming that they provided protection and leadership in exchange for peasant labor. But what protection did they actually provide? Protection from other nobles who might steal your crops. Protection from bandits who preyed on traveling merchants. Protection from foreign armies that occasionally marched through and burned your village. In practice, the noble protection racket was about as effective as you'd expect from people whose primary qualifications for leadership were having been born into the right families. Most nobles had no practical skills, no understanding of agriculture or commerce or administration. They were parasites who had convinced themselves they were essential. But here's what made the 1790s different from previous centuries of peasant misery. Ideas were changing. Books were being written and distributed that questioned whether kings really ruled by divine right. Political philosophers were suggesting that governments should serve the people rather than the other way around. These ideas were filtering down to rural communities slowly and imperfectly, but they were arriving nonetheless. Peasants were beginning to ask dangerous questions. Why should they pay taxes to support people who contributed nothing to society? Why should they accept starvation while others lived in luxury? Why should they believe that their suffering was part of God's plan when that plan seemed to work out so conveniently for the wealthy? The American Revolution had demonstrated that common people could successfully challenge established authority. Reports from across the Atlantic suggested that ordinary farmers and merchants had created a government based on principles of equality and popular sovereignty. If it could happen in America, why not in France? These revolutionary ideas were spreading through underground networks of literate peasants, traveling merchants, and radical priests. Pamphlets were being passed from hand to hand, their contents discussed in secret meetings and whispered conversations. The intellectual foundation for revolution was being laid even as the material conditions of peasant life continued to deteriorate, and deteriorate they did. The late 1780s and early 1790s were marked by particularly severe weather that destroyed crops across much of France. Harvest failures meant bread prices skyrocketed just as unemployment increased and wages fell. The gap between survival and starvation narrowed to almost nothing for millions of peasant families. But this time, when the crisis hit, people didn't just accept it as natural disaster or divine punishment. They began to understand it as the predictable result of a political and economic system that prioritized aristocratic luxury over basic human survival. They began to see their suffering not as inevitable, but as the result of specific policy choices made by specific people who could be held accountable. The stage was being set for an explosion that would reshape not just France, but the entire concept of political authority throughout Europe. And you, as a French peasant in the 1790s, were living through the final moments before that explosion would change everything forever. The winter of 1793 brought something new to your miserable existence, something that made the usual hunger and cold feel almost quaint by comparison: political chaos. Because apparently, regular peasant suffering wasn't quite hellish enough without adding the delightful seasoning of revolutionary terror and counter-revolutionary violence. You see, while you were busy trying not to die of starvation, the rest of France had decided to have a revolution, which sounds great in theory. Down with the aristocrats, equality for all, no more feudal oppression. Except revolutions, as it turns out, are significantly less fun when you're trying to survive them. The local priest, who used to just take your money and lecture you about accepting God's will, had now been replaced by a revolutionary official who took your money and lectured you about accepting the people's will. The tax collectors still showed up regularly, except now they called themselves representatives of the Republic and demanded grain requisitions instead of feudal dues. Same extortion, different paperwork. And the violence. Oh, the violence was spectacular. Roving bands of revolutionaries would sweep through rural areas looking for counter-revolutionary conspirators, which was convenient because literally anyone could be accused of counter-revolutionary activity. Did you seem insufficiently enthusiastic about the latest political decree? Counter-revolutionary. Did you hide grain instead of turning it over to the state? Counter-revolutionary. Did you fail to attend a patriotic celebration because you were dying of typhus? definitely counter-revolutionary. Meanwhile, royalist forces were doing exactly the same thing from the opposite direction. They would arrive in villages looking for Republican sympathizers, which was equally convenient because everyone was potentially a Republican sympathizer. Did you fail to hide the local priest when the revolutionaries came looking? Republican traitor. Did you sell grain to revolutionary forces instead of letting your family starve? Republican collaborator. Did you use the new revolutionary calendar instead of the traditional Christian one? Obviously a dangerous radical. So you found yourself caught between two groups of armed fanatics, each convinced that you were secretly working for the other side, each demanding proof of loyalty that you couldn't provide, each perfectly willing to kill you and your entire family based on the flimsiest evidence, or no evidence at all. The revolutionary government had introduced something called the maximum, which was supposed to be a maximum price for essential goods like bread. This sounds reasonable until you realize that the maximum was set at artificially low levels that made it impossible for farmers to make a profit growing grain. So farmers stopped growing grain, or they sold it on black markets, or they fed it to their animals rather than sell it to the government at a loss. The predictable result was that bread became even scarcer than before, except now you could be executed for charging more than the official price. Bakers who couldn't afford to bake bread at maximum prices simply closed their shops. Farmers who couldn't afford to sell grain at maximum prices let their fields lie fallow. The revolutionary solution to high food prices was to make food disappear entirely. But don't worry, the government had a solution for this too: more terror. If people weren't growing enough food, it must be because they were sabotaging the revolution. If bread wasn't available at maximum prices, it must be because counter-revolutionaries were hoarding it. The answer was obviously to execute more people until the economic laws of supply and demand started obeying revolutionary decrees. You watched neighbors disappear in the middle of the night, arrested on charges that made no sense and never seen again. You learned to keep your opinions to yourself, assuming you had been foolish enough to develop opinions in the first place. You discovered that survival now required not just avoiding starvation and disease, but also avoiding the attention of whichever political faction happened to be in power this week. And the factions changed regularly. Girondins, Jacobins, Thermidorians, each group absolutely certain that their particular vision of revolutionary virtue was the only thing standing between France and complete disaster. Each group convinced that their political enemies were in league with foreign powers. Each group perfectly willing to use mass execution as a tool of public policy. The guillotine, that marvel of egalitarian execution technology, had made killing so efficient that death had become a form of political theater. Public executions were treated as patriotic festivals, complete with cheering crowds and souvenir programs. Watching people die had become a form of civic participation. But here's what made this particularly special for you as a peasant. The revolution that was supposedly being fought for your benefit had somehow made your life measurably worse. The aristocrats were gone, which was nice, but they had been replaced by middle-class lawyers and merchants who were just as eager to extract resources from rural areas and just as contemptuous of peasant concerns. The revolutionary government needed money to fight wars against the rest of Europe, so they instituted new taxes that were even more burdensome than the old feudal obligations. They needed soldiers for their armies, so they instituted military conscription that took away young men who were desperately needed for agricultural labor. They needed food for their cities, so they instituted grain requisitions that left rural areas without enough food to survive. And they needed political loyalty, so they instituted surveillance systems that made the old royal spies look like amateurs. Every village had informants. Every conversation was potentially treasonous. Every gesture was analyzed for signs of insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm. The church, which had at least provided some comfort and community structure, had been systematically destroyed. Priests were forced to take loyalty oaths to the revolutionary government, which split congregations between those who supported constitutional priests and those who remained loyal to refractory priests who refused to swear allegiance to the state. Religious festivals were banned and replaced with revolutionary celebrations that nobody understood and fewer people enjoyed. The traditional calendar was replaced with a revolutionary calendar that divided months into 10-day weeks and renamed all the months after seasonal agricultural activities, because apparently even time itself needed to be revolutionized. Churches were converted into temples of reason, where citizens were supposed to worship abstract concepts like liberty and equality instead of traditional saints. These ceremonies were awkward affairs where poorly educated officials read speeches about civic virtue to audiences who were mostly thinking about where their next meal was coming from. The revolutionary government also decided that traditional marriage was insufficiently egalitarian, so they instituted civil marriage ceremonies and made divorce legal. This might have been progressive in theory, but in practice it just created more paperwork and confusion for people who were already struggling to navigate an increasingly complex legal system. And speaking of legal systems, revolutionary justice was swift and decisive, which is a polite way of saying that trials were brief formalities before predetermined executions. Revolutionary tribunals operated on the principle that accusations were probably true and that it was better to execute innocent people than to risk letting guilty ones escape. The burden of proof had been reversed. Instead of the state having to prove that you were guilty, you had to prove that you were innocent, which was impossible because innocence was measured by impossible standards of revolutionary purity. Had you ever expressed any doubts about revolutionary policies? Had you ever failed to attend patriotic celebrations? Had you ever been seen talking to someone who was later executed as a traitor? But let's talk about what happened to your economic situation during this glorious period of liberation. The revolutionary government had abolished feudalism, which sounds wonderful until you realize that feudal obligations were often the only thing standing between peasants and complete destitution. Under the old system, your lord had been obligated to provide certain forms of assistance during times of crisis. If your crops failed, he might provide seed grain for the next planting season. If you were too old or sick to work, he might allow you to remain in your cottage without paying rent. If bandits or soldiers threatened your village, he was supposed to provide protection. These obligations were often ignored or inadequately fulfilled, but at least they existed in theory. Under the revolutionary system, you were free and equal, which meant you were free to starve and equal in your complete lack of any safety net whatsoever. The revolutionary government sold off church lands and noble estates, which was supposed to benefit peasants by making land available for purchase. In practice, these lands were bought up by wealthy bourgeois investors who had cash to spend, while peasants who might have benefited from land redistribution couldn't afford to buy anything. So you went from being exploited by hereditary aristocrats to being exploited by revolutionary capitalists, except the new exploiters were more efficient and less constrained by traditional obligations to provide minimal assistance during emergencies. The labor situation became particularly nightmarish. The revolutionary government needed workers for war production, so they instituted labor conscription that was even more burdensome than the old corvée system. Instead of working a few days per year on road maintenance, you might be conscripted for months at a time to work in armaments factories or military construction projects. And this conscripted labor was presented as patriotic service to the Republic, which meant you were supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to work without pay for the glory of the nation. Complaining about labor conscription was evidence of insufficient revolutionary spirit, which could get you executed. The monetary system had completely collapsed. The revolutionary government had issued paper money called assignats, which were supposed to be backed by the value of confiscated church and noble lands. In practice, the government printed so many assignats that they became essentially worthless. Inflation was so severe that prices changed daily. A loaf of bread that cost 10 assignats in the morning might cost 20 assignats by evening. Workers demanded to be paid in gold or silver or goods, but employers insisted on paying in increasingly worthless paper currency. This monetary chaos made it almost impossible to engage in any kind of economic planning. You couldn't save money because it lost value too quickly. You couldn't make long-term contracts because nobody knew what anything would be worth next month. You couldn't even engage in simple barter because the relative values of goods were changing so rapidly. Black markets flourished, but participating in black market activities was counter-revolutionary profiteering, punishable by death. So you could choose between following the law and starving, or breaking the law and risking execution. Either way, your prospects were not encouraging. The transportation system had been disrupted by constant warfare and political upheaval. Roads that had been poorly maintained under the old regime were now completely impassable. Bridges had been destroyed by retreating armies or advancing revolutionaries. Canal systems had been abandoned when their noble owners were executed or fled the country. This meant that even when food was available in one region, it couldn't be transported to regions where it was desperately needed. Local famines became more severe because the infrastructure for distributing resources had been systematically destroyed. Communication networks had also been disrupted. The postal system, which had never been reliable, now barely functioned at all. Letters were intercepted and read by government censors. Travelers were stopped and searched for counter-revolutionary correspondence. Information moved slowly and unreliably when it moved at all. This isolation made it even easier for government officials to lie to you about policies and regulations. They could claim that new laws had been passed or that exemptions had been granted, and you had no way to verify their claims. Local corruption flourished in this environment of confusion and poor communication. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of life during the revolutionary period was the complete unpredictability of everything. Under the old regime, your life had been terrible, but at least it had been predictably terrible. You knew what taxes you would have to pay, what obligations you would have to fulfill, what punishments you would face for various infractions. Under the revolutionary system, the rules changed constantly. Laws that were mandatory one week were counter-revolutionary the next week. Officials who were heroes one month were traitors the next month. Behaviors that were praised as patriotic could suddenly become evidence of suspicious activity. You couldn't plan for the future because you had no idea what the future would bring. You couldn't rely on traditional sources of authority because all traditional authorities had been eliminated or compromised. You couldn't even trust your neighbors because anyone might be an informant or might be suspected of being an informant. The social fabric of rural communities had been completely shredded. Traditional hierarchies based on age, experience, and local knowledge had been replaced by revolutionary hierarchies based on political connections and ideological purity. Young men who spouted revolutionary slogans were given authority over older, more experienced community members. Local customs and traditions that had provided stability and continuity were banned as remnants of feudal superstition. Traditional festivals were replaced with revolutionary celebrations. Traditional songs were replaced with patriotic hymns. Traditional clothing was replaced with revolutionary fashions that were supposed to demonstrate your commitment to equality. Even your name might be changed. The revolutionary government encouraged citizens to abandon Christian names in favor of names taken from classical antiquity or revolutionary heroes. Children were given names like Brutus and Liberty instead of traditional French names. Family relationships were also revolutionized. Parental authority was undermined by revolutionary ideology that emphasized the rights of youth. Children were encouraged to report on their parents if they suspected counter-revolutionary activity. Traditional marriage customs were abandoned in favor of civil ceremonies that emphasized the couple's duty to the state rather than their obligations to each other. The revolutionary government had created a society where nobody could trust anyone, where survival required constant vigilance against political persecution, and where the most basic human relationships had been poisoned by ideological suspicion, and through it all, you were still hungry. The revolution had changed everything except the fundamental reality that there wasn't enough food to go around. Political slogans about equality and fraternity didn't fill empty stomachs. Revolutionary festivals didn't provide calories. Patriotic speeches didn't prevent malnutrition. If anything, the food situation had gotten worse because revolutionary policies had disrupted agricultural production and distribution systems without replacing them with anything more effective. The maximum had created artificial scarcities. Labor conscription had reduced the agricultural workforce. Monetary instability had made it impossible for farmers to plan production cycles. So you found yourself in the remarkable position of being hungry, cold, diseased, and terrified, but now also politically liberated. You were free to starve as an equal citizen rather than as a feudal subject. Or you were dying with dignity in a republic rather than dying with shame under a monarchy. The irony was not lost on those peasants who were still capable of appreciating irony. They had traded King Louis XVI for Robespierre, feudal obligations for revolutionary conscription, aristocratic exploitation for bourgeois exploitation, religious oppression for ideological oppression. But here's the thing about revolutions. They don't stay revolutionary forever. Eventually, the violence exhausts itself. The ideological fervor burns out. The practical problems of governing reassert themselves. And slowly, gradually, a new form of stability emerges from the chaos. By the mid-1790s, the most extreme phase of revolutionary terror was ending. Robespierre himself had been executed, which sent a clear message that even the most powerful revolutionaries were not immune to the violence they had unleashed. The Directory that replaced the radical Jacobin government was more moderate, more pragmatic, and more interested in consolidating power than in pursuing ideological purity. But for you, as a peasant who had somehow survived the worst years of the revolution, the end of the terror didn't necessarily mean the end of your suffering. It just meant a different kind of suffering, one that was perhaps less dramatic, but no less grinding. The new government still needed money, so taxes remained high. They still needed soldiers, so military conscription continued. They still needed food for the cities, so grain requisitions persisted. The revolutionary rhetoric about equality and fraternity was quietly abandoned, but the practical policies that extracted resources from rural areas remained in place. And now there was a new problem: war, constant, expensive, devastating war against the rest of Europe, which saw revolutionary France as a threat to the entire established order. French armies marched back and forth across the countryside, requisitioning supplies, conscripting soldiers, and generally making life even more difficult for people who were already struggling to survive. Military campaigns required enormous resources. Soldiers needed to be fed, clothed, armed, and paid. Horses needed fodder, weapons needed to be manufactured, fortifications needed to be built and maintained. All of this came at the expense of civilian needs, which meant less food, fewer manufactured goods, and higher taxes for everyone who wasn't actively fighting. The war also brought foreign armies onto French soil. Austrian, Prussian, and British forces invaded France repeatedly, burning villages, destroying crops, and killing civilians. Rural areas became battlefields where peasants were caught between opposing armies, each of which viewed the local population as potential enemies or sources of supply. So you might survive the revolutionary government only to be killed by counter-revolutionary forces, or survive both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary violence, only to be killed by foreign invaders, or survive all the political violence, only to die of starvation because armies had requisitioned all the food in your region. The war created a new class of refugees, peasants who had been driven from their homes by military action and who wandered the countryside looking for somewhere safe to settle. These refugees competed with local populations for scarce resources and sometimes turned to banditry when they couldn't find legitimate means of survival. Deserters from various armies also roamed the countryside, living off theft and extortion. Some formed organized bands that controlled entire regions, extracting tribute from travelers and terrorizing isolated communities. The breakdown of law and order had created a situation where violence was the most reliable means of acquiring resources. But despite all this chaos and suffering, something remarkable was happening. Ideas were spreading. The revolutionary period had accelerated the circulation of information and challenged traditional sources of authority in ways that couldn't be completely reversed. Peasants who had been completely illiterate a decade earlier were learning to read, partly because revolutionary governments had emphasized education as a tool of political mobilization, and partly because literacy had become necessary for survival in a world of constantly changing laws and regulations. Books and pamphlets that had once been restricted to wealthy elites were now circulating in rural areas. Political concepts that had once been abstract philosophical theories were being discussed in village taverns and market squares. The idea that governments should serve the people rather than the other way around had taken root, even if current governments weren't living up to that ideal. The experience of revolution had also demonstrated that political change was possible. The old regime, which had seemed permanent and unshakable, had been overthrown in a matter of months. Traditional authorities had been revealed to be mortal and fallible. The divine right of kings had been exposed as a convenient fiction. This knowledge was dangerous to any government that wanted to rule without the consent of the governed. Even if the current directory was almost as oppressive as the old monarchy, people now knew that oppressive governments could be changed. The precedent had been established, and there were signs that France was slowly stabilizing. The most extreme revolutionary policies were being quietly abandoned. The maximum was lifted, allowing prices to find their natural levels. Religious persecution was reduced, allowing churches to reopen. Political surveillance was relaxed, making it safer to express opinions. The monetary system was gradually stabilized as the government stopped printing worthless assignats and returned to more traditional forms of currency. Trade began to resume as transportation networks were rebuilt and commercial law was clarified. Agricultural production started to recover as farmers gained confidence that they would be allowed to keep at least some of their harvests. The threat of arbitrary confiscation was reduced, making it worthwhile to invest effort in improving crop yields. But recovery was slow and uneven. Some regions that had been devastated by warfare took years to return to even minimal levels of productivity. Some communities that had been torn apart by political violence never fully recovered their social cohesion, and the fundamental problems that had caused the revolution in the first place hadn't been solved. France was still a largely agricultural society, trying to support an expensive government and military establishment. The tax burden was still crushing for people at the bottom of the economic hierarchy. Social mobility was still extremely limited. The revolution had changed the personnel of government and the rhetoric of politics, but it hadn't fundamentally altered the economic relationships that kept most people poor. Peasants were still peasants, even if they were now called citizens. They were still doing backbreaking agricultural labor for minimal compensation. They were still vulnerable to harvest failures, disease, and economic disruption. But something had changed in their consciousness. They had seen that change was possible. They had experienced, however briefly and imperfectly, a moment when their voices had mattered in political affairs. They had learned that they didn't have to accept suffering as natural or inevitable. This knowledge would shape French politics for generations to come. No future government could completely ignore popular opinion the way the old monarchy had. No future aristocracy could claim absolute authority without facing challenges. The revolution had created expectations that would never be completely suppressed. And as you struggled through another day of hunger, cold, and uncertainty in 1795, you carried with you something that your parents and grandparents had never possessed. Hope. Not necessarily hope that your own life would improve dramatically, but hope that your children might live in a better world. Hope that the suffering you were enduring might serve some larger purpose. Hope that someday the promise of equality and justice might become reality rather than just revolutionary rhetoric. It was that hope, fragile and battered, but somehow still flickering, that made you dangerous, because a peasant who expected nothing was manageable, a peasant who had seen the world turned upside down, who had watched kings lose their heads and nobles flee in terror, who had learned that the natural order wasn't so natural after all, that peasant was a problem waiting to happen. But let's talk about what your daily routine actually looked like in this brave new world of revolutionary chaos. You still woke up before dawn, not because you wanted to, but because survival required squeezing every possible hour of productivity out of each day. The rooster that used to wake you had probably been eaten months ago when the food situation got particularly desperate. So now you relied on your body's internal clock, which had been calibrated by years of grinding poverty to wake you at the most miserable possible moment. Your first task was still checking whether you had died during the night, which remained a legitimate concern given the combination of malnutrition, disease, exposure, and the ever-present possibility of political violence. Congratulations, you were still breathing. Now the fun could begin. Step 1 was assessing the overnight damage. Had it rained through the roof again? Had the goat somehow gotten loose and eaten your seed grain? Had soldiers passed through and helped themselves to whatever they felt like taking? Had anyone in your family developed symptoms of the latest epidemic disease making its rounds through the countryside? If you were extraordinarily lucky, the answers to all these questions was no, which meant you could proceed to the next phase of your morning routine, breakfast. And by breakfast, I mean staring at whatever pathetic food stores you had managed to accumulate and trying to calculate whether eating something today was worth the risk of having nothing to eat tomorrow. This was advanced mathematics for people who couldn't count past 20. How much bread could you afford to eat while still having enough left to survive until the next harvest? How much of your precious grain stores could you consume while still maintaining enough seed for spring planting? How much could you feed your family while still having enough left to pay whatever taxes or requisitions the government would inevitably demand? These calculations were complicated by the fact that you had no reliable information about future demands on your resources. The revolutionary government might decide to requisition additional grain for the army. Local officials might impose new taxes to fund military campaigns. Weather might destroy your crops before you could harvest them. Bandits might steal whatever you managed to save. So you made your best guess, divided your meager food supplies accordingly, and prepared what passed for a meal in revolutionary France. Usually this meant heating up leftover soup from the previous day, assuming there were leftovers, which there usually weren't. Sometimes it meant scraping together enough ingredients to make fresh soup, which was an optimistic term for hot water with whatever plant matter you could find floating in it. Cabbage soup was considered luxurious because cabbage had calories and nutrients. Turnip soup was standard fare. Grass soup was what you ate when the turnips ran out. Tree bark soup was what you ate when you were really desperate. And when even tree bark became unavailable, you just drank hot water and pretended it was nourishing. Your children had learned not to complain about the food, partly because there was no point in complaining about things that couldn't be changed, and partly because complaining required energy that was better conserved for survival. They ate whatever you put in front of them with the mechanical efficiency of people who understood that this might be the only meal they got today. After breakfast, assuming you could call it that, it was time to check on your livestock, which was a generous term for whatever animals you had managed to keep alive, despite the best efforts of tax collectors, soldiers, bandits, and the general hostility of the universe. If you still had a goat, you milked it, assuming it was producing milk, which it probably wasn't, because goats, like humans, need adequate nutrition to function properly. If you had chickens, you checked for eggs, which was an exercise in eternal optimism, because chickens that don't get fed regularly don't lay eggs regularly. But hope springs eternal, and sometimes you would find an egg, which was like discovering a small miracle hiding in the straw. If you had managed to keep a pig, you fed it whatever scraps you couldn't eat yourself, which wasn't much. Pigs were valuable because they could eventually be slaughtered for meat, but they were also expensive because they competed with humans for food resources. Keeping a pig alive required a constant calculation about whether the eventual meat would justify the daily expense of feeding it. Most of your animals were constantly on the verge of death from malnutrition, disease, or simple exhaustion. Veterinary care didn't exist, so when animals got sick, you tried whatever folk remedies you had learned from previous generations and hoped for the best. Usually the best didn't happen. Dead animals presented their own problems. You couldn't afford to waste the meat, but you also couldn't preserve it properly without salt, which was expensive and heavily taxed. So you would eat as much as possible immediately, share some with neighbors in hopes of future reciprocity, and watch the rest rot because you had no choice. After dealing with whatever remained of your livestock, it was time to address the day's primary activity, which was trying to extract some form of productivity from land that seemed actively hostile to agriculture. Your fields, assuming you had fields rather than just a small garden plot, required constant attention to prevent them from reverting to their natural state of producing nothing useful. Weeding was a never-ending battle because weeds, unlike crops, seem to thrive regardless of weather, soil quality, or political upheaval. They grew enthusiastically in conditions that killed everything else, mocking your efforts to cultivate anything edible. You spent hours every day pulling weeds by hand because you couldn't afford better tools and because weeds that were allowed to mature would steal nutrients from whatever crops you were trying to grow. Pest control was another constant challenge. Insects, rodents, and birds all seemed to understand that your crops represented months of labor and your only hope of survival, which made them irresistibly attractive targets. You had no effective pesticides, no reliable traps, and no way to protect your fields from the various creatures that wanted to eat your food before you could. Your scarecrow, if you had one, was probably just a pile of rags stuffed with straw and mounted on a stick. It might deter the most timid birds for a few days, but any self-respecting crow quickly figured out that it posed no actual threat. More sophisticated pest control required time and resources that you didn't have. Weather remained your constant enemy and occasional ally. Too much rain, and your crops rotted in the fields. Too little rain, and they withered and died. Too much wind, and they were blown down before they could mature. Hail could destroy months of work in a matter of minutes. Frost could kill tender plants overnight. You had no reliable weather forecasting, no insurance against crop failure, and no backup plan if the weather decided not to cooperate with your survival needs. You planted your seeds, tended your crops, and prayed to whatever deity you thought might be listening, knowing that your prayers would probably be ignored, but hoping that divine intervention might be more reliable than revolutionary government assistance. The tools you used for agricultural work were primitive and constantly breaking down. Your plow, if you had one, was probably made of wood with an iron blade that needed frequent sharpening. Your hoe had a wooden handle that cracked regularly and a metal head that dulled quickly. Your sickle was sharp enough to cut grain, but also sharp enough to cut you if you weren't careful, and being careful required energy and attention that you couldn't always spare. Maintaining these tools required skills you might not have, and materials you couldn't afford. Iron was expensive, and blacksmiths charged prices that reflected their monopoly on metalworking skills. Wood was theoretically free if you could cut it yourself, but good wood was increasingly scarce as forests were cleared for fuel and construction. So you made do with tools that barely functioned, improvised repairs with whatever materials were available, and accepted that equipment failure was just another factor that could destroy your chances of survival at any moment. During planting season, you worked from dawn to dusk, racing against weather and calendar to get seeds into the ground at the optimal time. Planting too early meant frost might kill the seedlings. Planting too late meant the growing season would be too short for crops to mature. The window of opportunity was narrow and unforgiving. You planted whatever seeds you had managed to save from the previous harvest, assuming the previous harvest had been successful enough to provide seeds. If not, you had to buy seeds, which meant spending money you didn't have on the promise of a future harvest that might not materialize. The seeds themselves were often of poor quality because you couldn't afford the best varieties and because proper seed selection required knowledge and resources that were beyond your reach. You planted what you had and hoped it would grow, knowing that failure meant starvation. During the growing season, you spent your days watching crops develop with the intensity of someone whose life depended on the outcome, which it did. You monitored growth rates, checked for signs of disease or pest damage, and worried constantly about factors beyond your control. Crop diseases were particularly devastating because you had no effective treatments and no way to prevent their spread. Blight could destroy entire fields in a matter of days. Fungal infections could render harvests inedible. Viral diseases could spread from plant to plant, leaving you with rows of withered stalks where you had expected food. When disease struck, your options were limited to watching your crops die and hoping that enough would survive to prevent complete starvation. There was no crop insurance, no government assistance for agricultural disasters, no safety net beyond whatever charity your neighbors might be able to provide, assuming they weren't facing their own disasters. Harvest time was simultaneously the most hopeful and most terrifying period of the agricultural year. This was when months of labor either paid off or proved to have been wasted effort. You worked frantically to gather crops before they rotted in the fields or were stolen by human or animal thieves. Harvesting required tools you might not have and labor you couldn't afford to hire. You cut grain by hand with a sickle, bundled it into sheaves, and transported it to wherever you planned to thresh it. Every step of the process was vulnerable to disaster. Rain during harvest could ruin grain that was ready to be gathered. Wind could scatter cut crops before they could be bundled. Theft was a constant concern because desperate people were willing to steal food even from other desperate people. Threshing grain required beating it with flails to separate the edible kernels from the inedible stalks and chaff. This was backbreaking work that took days to complete and produced clouds of dust that made breathing difficult. The grain you finally obtained was often contaminated with dirt, stones, and other debris that had to be painstakingly removed. Storage was another challenge because you had no effective way to protect harvested grain from rodents, insects, moisture, or theft. You kept it in whatever containers you could improvise, usually baskets or rough wooden boxes that provided minimal protection from the various threats to your food supply. Even after a successful harvest, you faced the problem of processing grain into something edible. Grinding grain into flour required access to a mill, which meant paying fees to whoever owned the mill and transporting heavy grain over poor roads. The flour you got back was often adulterated with sand or sawdust to increase the miller's profits. Baking bread required an oven, which most peasant homes didn't have. You either paid to use someone else's oven or baked flat cakes on hot stones. Either way, the bread you produced was dense, gritty, and barely edible by modern standards, but it represented survival in a world where edible calories were precious. But let's talk about what happened when all your agricultural efforts failed, which they did regularly, because farming in pre-industrial France was basically a sophisticated form of gambling where the house always had the advantage. Crop failure meant starvation, but starvation was a gradual process that gave you time to contemplate all the ways your situation could get worse. The first stage of starvation was hunger, which you were already familiar with because you were always hungry to some degree. But real hunger, the kind that came with crop failure, was different. It was a constant gnawing pain that made it difficult to think about anything else. It was weakness that made physical labor almost impossible just when you most needed to be searching for alternative food sources. As hunger progressed to actual starvation, your body began consuming itself to stay alive. You lost weight rapidly, your muscles wasted away, and your energy levels dropped to the point where even simple tasks became exhausting. Your thinking became clouded, your coordination deteriorated, and your immune system weakened, making you vulnerable to diseases that you might normally have survived. Starvation also affected your family relationships because there wasn't enough food to go around, and someone had to decide who got to eat and who didn't. Parents faced impossible choices between feeding themselves so they could work to find more food, or feeding their children and watching them die anyway, because there simply wasn't enough nutrition to keep everyone alive. These decisions destroyed families and communities because survival required abandoning the social bonds that had previously provided support and meaning. When resources became scarce enough, people turned against their neighbors, their friends, and sometimes even their relatives in desperate competition for whatever food might be available. Starvation also made you vulnerable to exploitation by anyone who had access to food resources. Landlords, tax collectors, merchants, and government officials could demand almost anything in exchange for small amounts of food because they knew you had no alternatives. Sexual exploitation, forced labor, and criminal activity all became more common during periods of extreme hunger. The psychological effects of starvation were as devastating as the physical effects. Watching your children slowly waste away while being unable to help them created trauma that lasted long after the immediate crisis had passed. Survivors of severe famines often suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though they had no name for it and no treatment for it. And through all of this, the revolutionary government continued to function as if your suffering was a minor inconvenience rather than a humanitarian disaster. Officials still demanded taxes, still requisitioned grain for military purposes, still conscripted young men for army service. The revolution might have changed the political rhetoric, but it hadn't changed the fundamental indifference of government to individual suffering. Local officials, many of whom were profiting from the chaos and disruption, showed little interest in addressing the root causes of rural poverty and hunger. They were more concerned with maintaining their own positions and extracting resources for their own benefit than with actually improving conditions for the people they were supposed to serve. The war economy had created new opportunities for corruption and profiteering. Military contractors made fortunes selling substandard supplies to the army at inflated prices. Government officials took bribes to overlook violations of price controls and trade restrictions. Merchants hoarded scarce goods to drive up prices and maximize profits. All of this corruption and profiteering was funded ultimately by the labor and resources of people like you who had no political power and no way to protect themselves from exploitation. The revolution had promised equality and justice, but in practice it had just created new forms of inequality and injustice. But here's what made your situation in the 1790s different from previous periods of peasant suffering. You now lived in a world where political change had been proven possible. You had seen that governments could be overthrown, that social hierarchies could be challenged, that ordinary people could, under the right circumstances, reshape their society. This knowledge was dangerous to anyone who wanted to maintain power through oppression because it meant that oppression was no longer accepted as natural or inevitable. Even if current conditions were terrible, even if the revolution had failed to deliver on its promises, the precedent had been established that change was possible, and change was coming, though not in the form that anyone expected. A young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte was beginning to make a name for himself in military circles. He was ambitious, brilliant, and completely ruthless, exactly the kind of person who thrives during periods of political chaos and social disruption. Napoleon understood that France was exhausted by revolution and ready for stability, even if that stability came at the cost of political freedom. He also understood that military success could be used to legitimize political authority and distract people from domestic problems. Within a few years, Napoleon would seize power in a military coup and begin transforming France from a chaotic republic into an efficient empire. He would end the Revolutionary Wars and begin the Napoleonic Wars. He would replace revolutionary ideology with imperial grandeur. He would substitute military glory for political liberty. For you, as a peasant who had somehow survived the worst excesses of revolutionary violence, Napoleon's rise to power would bring both relief and new forms of oppression. The arbitrary terror would end, but military conscription would intensify. Political surveillance would be reduced, but economic exploitation would continue. Religious persecution would cease, but imperial taxation would increase. Napoleon would bring order to France, but it would be the order of the barracks and the bureaucracy rather than the order of justice and equality that the revolution had promised. You would trade revolutionary chaos for imperial discipline, political freedom for military efficiency, ideological purity for pragmatic authoritarianism. But that's a story for another night. For now, as you settled into your pile of moldy straw in your one-room hovel, listening to your family's quiet breathing and the scurrying of rats in the walls, you could reflect on what you had experienced and what you had learned. You had lived through one of the most dramatic periods in human history, a time when an entire civilization had been turned upside down and rebuilt according to new principles. You had seen kings executed, nobles flee in terror, and common people briefly hold political power. You had witnessed the birth of modern democracy and the invention of modern terror. You had survived political violence, economic chaos, military conscription, and near starvation. You had watched your community torn apart by ideological conflict and slowly rebuilt according to new social arrangements. You had learned that change was possible, that authority was not permanent, and that ordinary people could shape history under the right circumstances. But you had also learned that revolution was not a panacea, that political change did not automatically solve economic problems, and that new forms of oppression could replace old ones without necessarily improving the lives of people at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Most importantly, you had learned that survival required more than just enduring hardship. It required adapting to constantly changing circumstances, forming new alliances when old ones failed, and maintaining hope even when hope seemed irrational. These lessons would serve you well in the years to come, because the story of your suffering was far from over. Napoleon's wars would bring new forms of violence and disruption. Economic modernization would create new forms of inequality and exploitation. Political developments would continue to reshape French society in ways that no one could predict. But you had proven that you could survive whatever history threw at you. You had endured the worst of times and lived to see another day. And in a world where survival itself was an achievement, that was enough. As sleep finally came, fitful and interrupted by hunger pangs and the sounds of night creatures searching for food in your walls, you carried with you something that previous generations of peasants had never possessed. The knowledge that the world could be different, that change was possible, and that even the most powerful authorities were ultimately mortal and fallible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new forms of suffering, and new tests of your ability to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush people like you. But tonight, you were still alive, still breathing, still capable of hope, and in the grand sweep of human history, that was perhaps the most revolutionary achievement of all. And yet, here you were, still breathing in a world that had tried its absolute best to kill you, which brings us to perhaps the most remarkable thing about being a French peasant in the 1790s. Ultimate, not the starvation, not the violence, not the crushing taxation or the political chaos. It was the fact that you had developed an almost supernatural ability to find tiny moments of humanity in the middle of complete hell. Because even in the darkest periods of revolutionary terror, even when bread was scarce and soldiers were requisitioning your last turnip, people still fell in love. They still told jokes around dying fires. They still sang lullabies to hungry children. They still gathered in secret to celebrate weddings, with ceremonies that consisted of nothing more than holding hands and making promises they had no idea how to keep. Your neighbor Marie, who had lost 2 children to disease and 1 to military conscription, still somehow found the energy to help deliver other people's babies. Old Jacques, who could barely walk because of a leg injury that never healed properly, still spent his evenings teaching neighborhood children how to whittle wooden toys from scraps of firewood. These weren't grand gestures of heroism. They were tiny acts of defiance against a universe that seemed committed to grinding human decency into dust. Every shared meal, every moment of laughter, every small kindness was a rebellion against the forces that wanted to reduce you to nothing more than a collection of survival instincts. And the stories. God, the stories you told each other, not the grand narratives of kings and battles that would fill history books, but the small, absurd, heartbreaking stories of daily life. The story of how Pierre's goat had learned to untie knots and kept escaping to eat the priest's cabbages. The story of how Catherine had hidden her family's last silver coin in a hollowed-out turnip for 6 months. The story of how young Antoine had walked 15 miles to bring his dying mother a handful of wildflowers. These stories became your currency, more valuable than the worthless assignats the government kept printing. They were proof that even in the worst of circumstances, human beings were still capable of creating meaning, of finding beauty in ugliness, of insisting that life was about more than just not dying. But let's be honest about what survival actually cost you, because while you had managed to keep breathing, you had paid a price that goes beyond anything measurable in money or physical suffering. You had been forced to compromise parts of yourself that should never have needed compromising. You had learned to ignore the cries of other people's children when your own family was starving. You had walked past neighbors who were obviously dying because helping them might have meant your own family's destruction. You had informed on people you cared about because the alternative was being informed on yourself. These weren't moral failures. They were the inevitable result of a system designed to pit desperate people against each other in competition for resources that should have been abundant enough for everyone. But knowing that didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. You carried the weight of every compromise, every moment of cowardice, every time you chose survival over principle. These memories would stay with you long after the immediate crisis had passed, surfacing in quiet moments to to remind you of what you had been forced to become. And yet somehow, you had also managed to preserve something essentially human. Maybe it was the way you still said good morning to your goat, even when you knew you might have to eat it before winter ended. Maybe it was the way you still tried to keep your children's hair clean, even when soap was an impossible luxury. Maybe it was the way you still looked up at the stars on clear nights and remembered that there was a world beyond your immediate suffering. The revolution had promised to make you equal, and in a twisted way, it had succeeded. You were equally miserable with everyone else at your social level. You were equally powerless in the face of forces beyond your control. You were equally forgotten by the people making decisions about your fate. But equality in misery wasn't what the revolutionary philosophers had been writing about. They had imagined equality in opportunity, in dignity, in the basic conditions that make human flourishing possible. What you had gotten instead was a more efficient form of oppression, one that used the language of liberation to justify continued exploitation. The saddest part was that many of the revolutionary ideals were genuinely beautiful. The idea that all people deserved basic rights, the notion that governments should serve their citizens rather than the other way around, the belief that human beings were capable of creating just and rational societies. These ideas had inspired millions of people to risk everything for the possibility of a better world. They had motivated farmers to leave their fields and fight against professional armies. They had convinced ordinary people that they could reshape civilization according to principles of reason and compassion. But somewhere between the beautiful ideals and the brutal realities of political power, something had gone horribly wrong. The revolution had devoured its own children, as revolutions tend to do. The very people who had fought hardest for change had been destroyed by the forces they had unleashed. And you, as someone who had never asked for revolution, but had been forced to live through its consequences, had learned a lesson that no political philosopher had bothered to teach. Change is possible, but change is not the same thing as improvement. Destroying old systems is easier than building better ones, and good intentions, no matter how sincere, are not enough to protect people from the unintended consequences of social upheaval. As the 1790s drew to a close and Napoleon's star began to rise, you found yourself in the strange position of being nostalgic for things you had never actually experienced. You missed the stability you had never had, the prosperity that had never existed for people like you, the sense of security that had always been an illusion. But you also carried with you something genuinely new, the knowledge that ordinary people could make history, the understanding that social arrangements were human creations rather than natural laws, the recognition that authority was always provisional and that power ultimately belonged to whoever was willing to exercise it. These insights would not make your life easier. If anything, they made your continued suffering more frustrating because you now understood that it was unnecessary. But they also gave you a different relationship to your own powerlessness. You were no longer a victim of incomprehensible forces. You were a participant in a historical process that you could understand, even if you couldn't control it. And so, as you finally drifted off to sleep on that pile of moldy straw, surrounded by the sounds of your family's breathing and the eternal scurrying of rats, You carried with you the strangest possible combination of knowledge. You knew that the world was capable of terrible cruelty. You knew that human beings could inflict unimaginable suffering on each other. You knew that good intentions could lead to horrific outcomes. But you also knew that people were capable of extraordinary kindness, even under the worst circumstances. You knew that communities could survive almost anything if they held together. You knew that hope was possible even when it was irrational. Most importantly, you knew that you had survived, not just physically, though that was remarkable enough. You had survived psychologically, spiritually, morally. You had been tested by forces that had destroyed stronger people, and you were still recognizably human. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be more hunger, more cold, more uncertainty. There would be Napoleon's wars, industrial changes, social upheavals that you couldn't yet imagine. The story of human suffering was far from over, but tonight, in this moment, you were still here, still breathing, still capable of love and hope, and small acts of defiance against despair. And in the grand catalogue of human achievement, that was perhaps the most revolutionary victory of all, because in the end, that's what the French Revolution was really about, not the political theories or the military campaigns or the rise and fall of governments. It was about ordinary people like you discovering that they were stronger than they had ever imagined, more resilient than anyone had given them credit for, and more capable of creating meaning in the midst of chaos than all the philosophers and politicians combined. You had lived through the end of one world and the birth of another. You had seen the future arriving in fragments, violent and beautiful and utterly unpredictable, and somehow, impossibly, you had made it through to tell the tale. Sweet dreams, citizen. You've earned them.